Welcome everyone to our Inside the Box lecture series. This is our last lecture of the semester. As you know, we try to put them earlier in the semester because you're going to be very busy for the next couple of weeks finishing up the semester. I am delighted tonight to introduce you to Dr. Jorge Otero-Pailos, who I've known for some time, and I'm just so happy he could come and speak to all of you. I'm going to tell you his amazing background right now. He's the director and professor of historic preservation at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. Jorge is an architect, an artist, and theorist, specializing in experimental forms of preservation. He is the founder and editor of the journal Future Interior, co-editor of Experimental Preservation. We have both of these books, journals at school. Author of Architect's Historical Turn, as well as a contributor to scholarly journals and books, including the Oxford Encyclopedia of Aesthetics and Rem Koolhaas's Preservation is Overtaking Us, which I can't get. It costs $250 for me to get that. Jorge Otero-Pailos is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences of Puerto Rico and has received awards from major art, architecture, and preservation organizations, including the Crest Foundation, the Graham Foundation, the Fitch Foundation, the Canadian Center for Architecture, UNESCO, and the AIA. He studied architecture at Cornell University and earned a doctorate in architecture at MIT. Jorge's work as an artist has been commissioned by and exhibited at major heritage sites, museums, foundations, and biennials, including Art Angel's Public Art Commission at the UK Parliament, the Venice Art Biennial, Victoria and Albert Museum, Louis Vuitton Gallery Museum, Thyssen-Bornemisza Art Contemporary, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Hong Kong's Tai Kwun Center for Heritage and Arts, Frieze London. Oh my gosh, so many. He is the recipient of a 2021 to 22 American Academy in Rome residency in the visual arts. Tonight is our adaptive reuse annual lecture. I am proud to hand it over to Jorge. So delighted you're here.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm blushing over here, you know, I just tell all the students how lucky they are to have you as a professor. So, as I am, as you know, a great admirer of your scholarship and your practice as an architect. So it's great to be here. Thank you all for joining and for making time to be in this lecture. I don't know how, I'd love for people to interrupt me throughout this, or maybe to, you know, we'll have a chance to talk during the Q&A. I should say I'm really pleased to be in the at the School of Visual Arts in your interior design program, because what we do in preservation is so much related to interior design. And I hope to show you some experimental projects that deal with interiors. But everything that we do has to do with the inside and the outside of buildings in preservation. And we always work with something that's already there. And I think most of you as preservationists, as interior designers, could be preservationists, or because your methods are really very similar to those of preservation. That is to say, you start with something that's already there. So it's very exciting to be here and to partake in your program. And I say that as an invitation for all of you who might be thinking about graduate school to think about exploring preservation programs. I would be delighted, of course, if you explored the Columbia Preservation Program, and I'll put in a link later on during the Q&A to our program so you can explore it. But of course, you know, the great interest is for us to have more interior designers in the field of preservation. So with that said, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the ethics of dust I'm going to get to the ethics of dust. I'm going to show you a few works that lead to the ethics of dust. It's a series I've been working on for a very long time. One of the works in the ethics of dust is on the cover of this book, Historic Preservation Theory, which I have here, which is a new anthology of historic preservation theory from the 18th century to the 21st century. And it's a book to really get you started in thinking about design as something that begins in relationship to something existing. And what is that something existing? What is architecture? How do we define architecture? How do we define an interior? What is the totality, the architectural totality? So I'm going to make the argument that architecture comes in pieces and it becomes pieces. And some of those pieces can be large and small, and some of them are very small. They're dust. So I'm going to talk about that dust. So now the book has almost 100 essays, and I've highlighted a few that are interesting to me. And I'm trying, this book just came out, so I'm very excited about it. So every opportunity I have to talk about it, I talk about it, but I really want to use it as a way to reframe some of the works that I'm about to show you, so that because these works were really important for me as I began to engage in my work. And one of them, for example, is Jacques Derrida's 1978 essay on the parergon. Now, parergon is a Greek word. Ergon means work, and para means next to the work. So it's an essay that this French philosopher wrote about what is a work. And so to the point that I was trying to make before, what is architecture? What is the work of architecture? Well, a lot of times what we do is next to the work of architecture. So you could think of interior design as a work that is next to architecture or that extends architecture. And I think of preservation as a work next to the work. And so I'm going to show you a project of experimental preservation that actually dealt with this question. So this is the United States Embassy in Norway, in Oslo. And this embassy was constructed by Eero Saarinen in the 1950s, 1957 to 59. It's a triangular building. It's a very interesting layout. And over time, because of security concerns, starting in the 1970s and on till after 2001, different pieces of the building started to get closed up until finally a fence was put around the building itself. And this security fence became the point of contention at the moment when the United States decided to sell this embassy. And if you look at the building itself, here you have the building. This is the triangular building. And here you have the fence. Hopefully you can see my cursor. I'm not sure if you can or can't. But there you have the fence going all around the building. Now, if you look at the red square over here, this indicates the location of the embassy. And of course, it's in a prime location in Norway because it is right in front of the King's Palace. And the King's Palace presides in an axial form over the city of Oslo, leading to the National Theatre, to the first buildings of the National University, and further down the Parliament of Norway. So this is a very prominent site that the United States had. The United States decided to sell this embassy to build a more secure, larger embassy outside of Oslo. And the minute that the United States sold it, the Norwegians decided to make it into a national monument. Now, why is this place so important for the United States? Well, you can see Norway is a very long country, and it goes over Sweden and Finland and shares a border with Russia. So over the whole Cold War, and even today, Norway is a very strategic partner of the United States. And so that embassy in Norway is very important. And in fact, the head of NATO today is a former prime minister of Norway. And so NATO became a very important point of contention in Norwegian politics when Norway decided to join NATO, because, it was considered to be a provocation to Russia for Norway to join NATO. And you've seen similar discussions today with Finland and Sweden, they both had kept outside of NATO because they were worried about provoking Russia. And so when there were discussions to do this, there were great demonstrations outside of the US Embassy of opponents to joining the alliance. But overall, the embassy remained rather open. People could go in and out and experience the embassy. And eventually this fence was put up, which closed the entrance to the embassy. And when it was turned into a monument, the Norwegian authorities decided that the fence should be removed and that we should go back to the way that the building looked like when in the 1950s, before it was closed up. And I had a very big argument with them because I said, wait a minute, for about a third of the life of this building, it has had this fence in front of it. Isn't it an important part of the history of the building? Something that at least we should retain some kind of element, some testament to the fact that this building was closed. I didn't get very far. I then made the argument, well, this building is really not an embassy. An embassy is the people inside of the building that work there. The buildings of the United States that serve those embassies are called chanceries. And chancery, the word, comes from the Latin word for gates and fences. So actually the whole building is a fence, and we have a fence in front of a fence. So shouldn't it really be? And it didn't go anywhere. And so ultimately what happened is I spoke to the new owner, and the new owner very graciously donated the fence to me. And I staged a performance in front of the embassy where I took these machines and I crushed the fence. And I'm going to show you a little video. But here we are doing this performance outside and of course we crushed the fence, and then we turned it into these twisted pieces of metal. And then I took these twisted pieces of metal and I laid them out in a yard not very far from the embassy, and then began to select some of them and to put them together into a series of sculptures. So here we are in this field where we're looking at these different fragments of the fence, and then we some of those up. Each of them is different. Each of them has a record of its demolition, a record of the process of taking it down. And I was very interested in this idea that an object can bear a trace of its history and bear a trace of its transformation from one phase to another. And so here we are putting these together into these large sculptures. And this one, which is called Polar Partnership, is going to be outside of the embassy. It's going to go back to where the fence used to be as a testament of the way that there was of the fact that there was a fence there before. So
the kind of view of culture.
We're just gonna. So here you have one of the fences right here, turned into a sculpture. Another one, I made a number of them. This one's called Biosignature Preservation. Now, the titles of these fences come from the treaties that were signed between the United States and Norway. And so they tell a story of the meaning of the relationship between the United States and Norway. And they tell the story of the logic of these fences in international relations and in geopolitics. And I took the transformation of the fences, of the turning them into sculptures, for me was a way of both preserving them, because otherwise they would have ended up in the garbage can, but also of telling their story, of using the fences to enact the meanings of their logic, to enact their logic in international relations. And so they take the names of these treaties because that's where the logic is, let's say, spelled out legally. And biosignature preservation is a very interesting one because it has to do with finding life on Mars. And so part of the logic is to put fences up in Mars. You know, how do we go and put new fences up in Mars? Some of the other treaties have to do, like this one, for example, Polar Partnerships, has to do with how do we put fences, new fences up in the North Pole, which is melting. And of course, all of the polar countries, including Norway, the United States, Canada, Russia, Denmark, and others, are trying to figure out who's going to own the North Pole once it thaws out and becomes land. This one's airworthiness, which has to do with the development of airships, spaceships that are going to fly to Mars. This one's called analog sites, which has to do with the development of sites on planet Earth where architectures can be tested that will be used in Mars. And this byproduct material, which is a very interesting one to me, because of course, all these fences are byproduct material, but byproduct material has to do with how do we deal with waste once we get to Mars? You know, what is that byproduct material? So I made some smaller ones as well. They each deal with different topics. This one in the foreground deals with, it's called Holders of Traditional and Local Knowledge, which has to do with engaging the Inuit populations and the Sami populations in the North Pole, basically in research. Research to map out what are the mineral deposits that are exploitable in the future. So, so when you look at these pieces, they're pieces of the fence that have migrated away from architecture. And I'm very interested in that. I'm very interested in the idea that, okay, this is the work next to the work. This is the parargon. This is a fence that is in front of the building, but now the fence is moving away from the building, and it's moving away, but it's taking the stories of the building with it, and it's telling the stories elsewhere. And it's still always related back to the architecture. So I'm very interested in this idea that a piece of a building can be moved and still be related to the architecture, and in a way extend where architecture ends beyond the lot line. And this could be something that you think of as a movement away from the building towards the outside, and it could be also a movement that you could think of in the inside, you know, as the walls come inward inside the building. And of course, that's what I started thinking about in this project that I did recently for the American Academy in Rome. Started thinking to myself, well, how small can a piece of the building be? And I started thinking here about dust. And of course, the whole building of the American Academy in Rome, as you can see on the right, the courtyard is full of little fragments of other buildings that come from elsewhere. And these little fragments are ancient, some of them are medieval, some of them they actually really don't know where they come from, but they have been put together in a beautiful way, reassembled on the wall to tell a new story about history. And actually, that's how historians write history. They take little pieces of evidence from here and there, and then they fit them together into some image that we call a chapter in a history book. And of course, for me, what was important was to think of the dust on the surface of this building, on the surface of this wall, as yet another fragment that should be included in that story. And so what kinds of stories do we get? So I did this project, which is on the right. And I don't know if you notice here, but of course, my cast is this one over here. I casted with latex. I'll tell you more about this process in a second. But what I really did here, very intentionally, was to leave this, I call this a bikini mark. You know, it's my bikini line. Above it is dirty, and below it is clean. And so this I proposed, and it was accepted as a long-term artwork at the American Academy in Rome. And the idea is here that they will never repaint this wall, and they will just let it collect dust anew. And this line will hopefully be perpetually there. The title of it is "Therefore by Bodies Unseen, Does Nature Does Its Work." And this is a line from Lucretius. Lucretius was an ancient scientist. And I love ancient scientists because they wrote their scientific reports in poems. And I would just love it if contemporary scientists did the same thing. So that's a line in one of his poems. And Lucretius is famous for having observed dust and observed the movement of dust. And he is credited as as one of the people that theorized the existence of unseen bodies, which we today call atoms, as the elemental form, the elements of nature. He didn't have microscopes, but he theorized that there was these, by looking at dust, he said, dust has got to be it, right? It's as close as he could get. Dust has got to be it, because actually we can't see it all the time. Sometimes we can see it. So he likened dust to atoms as the smallest fragment of what makes everything visible. And in fact, when you look at a building, most of what you're seeing is actually dust. So I took a bunch of casts from around the American Academy, and I put them all back together in a very in a new composition, almost like a stained glass window that you could kind of reassemble the architecture of the American Academy and think about a new totality. And in that, bringing forward this material, dust, as intrinsic to it. Now, I think this is interesting for you guys as interior designers, because what am I doing here? I'm taking a material from the building itself and rearranging it within the building. And so I'm not really adding, but I am rearranging the pieces and creating a new kind of experience that makes you reconceptualize the existing building, reimagine what it really is, it is made out of, where it comes from, where it's going, what are the pieces of it. So this led me to think about these pieces as distributed monuments. And so I have this whole line of work and of investigation called where I take these works and think of them to expand the notion of what a monument is. So just as we're talking about architecture, monumental architecture or historic buildings that we call monuments, when we start taking little pieces of them and we start distributing them, new ways of thinking of monuments are possible. That are not the monument being static or belonging to place or being, so much about identity, but they begin to open up different ideas. Now, I've worked on this. I arrived at this working on projects for a very long time that I call the ethics of dust. And the ethics of dust are these projects where I clean historic buildings and I clean the interiors of historic monuments. And here I am with a team. This was a commission by Art Angel, which is a public art foundation in London. And we cleaned the interior of Westminster Hall. This building is 1,000 years old. It is the entrance to the British Parliament. So from this building, you enter the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And here we are on June 23rd, 2016. Now, what was happening then was that was the date of the Brexit vote. So by sheer coincidence, we were installing this work where we had taken the dust from the wall on the right, transferred it onto latex, and moved it 4 meters in front of the wall. Sounds easier said than done because it took us 6 years to do that. But essentially, it took us 6 years to move dust 4 meters from the wall. But outside, there was this whole vote that nobody was really thinking about. We were all just kind of, oh yeah, the Brexit vote. Nobody, everybody assumed that people were going to vote to stay in. And of course, the next day we came in to the building and we started seeing that there were more and more journalists. And of course, what had happened was that the British had voted to leave the European Union. And this was perceived as a very momentous event in British politics. So here we are putting our final touches on the installation, and next to us are gathering these masses of journalists that are waiting for the politicians to come in and out to interview them and to ask them what happened. So, Boris Johnson is there, was walking in and out, Nigel Farage and others. And it was a very tense moment in British politics because a couple days before, a Labour politician called Joe Cox was murdered in the front stoop of her home by a radical right-winger because of her defense of Britain's position in the European Union. So, it was a very tense moment. And we were right there, and in front of the Ethics of Dust, we shared the space with this memorial to Joe Cox. And outside, I was staying in Soho and walking down to Westminster Hall. Now, most people know Westminster Hall, as the building next to Big Ben. Big Ben is attached to Westminster Hall, but Westminster Hall is 1,000 years old. Big Ben is barely 100 and some years old. And of course, across the street is Westminster Abbey, which you can see over here. And what was happening, this street is Pall Mall, and this is where all the government ministries are. And it became full every day of demonstrators protesting Brexit. And this is street in front of 10 Downing Street. People were stopping and screaming, "Shame on you, shame on you." It was a very tense atmosphere, of course, of what happened after that. I don't know if you can hear it. Maybe I can just go on. I mean, you get the picture. But people would gather, and of course, they gathered in front, and this is Parliament Square, and this building over here, that's Westminster Hall. Okay, and so it was on the inside, you had this very tense space with 1,000 years of dust gathered and showing inside of the building, and then all these people who were being kept outside and not allowed to go in. But of course, what happened was that word got out that we had created a kind of loophole in the whole system, because you could get a ticket to go see the Ethics of Dust in Westminster Hall for free and go into to Westminster Hall. So all of these protesters started getting tickets to go see the artwork, and actually ended up getting into Westminster Hall and accosting all the politicians and so on. But Westminster Hall is a very important building because, of course, it has lasted and it has been a government building for 1,000 years. And here you have, Big Ben right next to it, attached to it. Big Ben is in the neo-Gothic style because Westminster Hall, which you can see down here, is in the Gothic style. It is a Gothic building. And so to match that, Pugin and Barry designed in the neo-Gothic style. And it has survived the fire that that took down basically the rest of the government buildings around it, and that laid a ground, tabula rasa for that building. It's a very important building for us too, as Americans, because we wouldn't have our kind of democracy without it. It's the first building where a king was put to death. People think about the French Revolution, but this is a very important interior. We're talking about how do we understand interiors. Understanding the stories that go into these places is very important. So King Charles I wanted to be modern. He wanted to have a modern country. And he said, who's the most modern of them all? The French. The French have an absolute monarchy, and they're doing really well. They're colonizing the entire world. We need to be as modern as them. So he tried to dissolve Parliament. And Parliament reminded him that his forefathers had signed the Magna Carta and had given over powers, shared powers with the nobles, and that he couldn't just do that. So they actually put him, they sent a militia to capture him. They tried him in Westminster Hall and decided to put him to death. And so this was the first regicide, as a result of which you have the Cromwellian moment in British history. But more importantly, what we have is the idea that the ruler needs to have checks and balances on them. And that is what we enact every 4 years in American politics. We put the king to death symbolically every 4 years, and we bring in a new king after that. Now, This place is also important. This interior not only has gathered histories, but has gathered also materials. So just as we have little pieces of Charles I flying around, we have also the whole atmosphere of London that has been adhered to the walls. And of course, the Great Smog of London of the 1950s, you can see here, this was the lying in state of King George VI in 1952, the very year of the Great Smog. And if you look to the walls over here, you can see the stains on these walls. That is environmental pollution from London. So the history of this building is one of being also an environmental sensor. And in many ways, interiors are wonderful environmental sensors, especially if you leave them alone for a very long time, because they start collecting dust on them. And so now here, this is the funeral procession of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022. So 70 years later, you can see the wall is very clean. And of course, you know, we are partially responsible for it being very clean because that's the wall that we cleaned for 6 years. Never mind these, you know, volumes. They were created just for the newspapers, you know, the journalists. They're actually fake. They're painted to look like stone, but they're not stone. So there is that's just temporary over there. So now the walls also contained a history of experimental preservation of a very polemical kind, which was the explosion of DDT canisters inside of Westminster Hall to kill all the bugs, the beetles, in the wooden truss building that holds that space together, which is a very famous hammer beam oak truss that was falling apart because it has in it a beetle, a pest that is called the Death Watch beetle, because it looks at the dead monarchs from above as it eats away the oak. And of course, they were trying to get rid of it. I think they finally did, but that oak beam roof already in the 1920s was mostly reconstructed inside as iron. So, you know, this idea of smell, this idea of particulate matter, what does that DDT smell like? What is the death of a building? When does a building end? For Marcel Proust, who was very interested in smell, you all probably know the story of the Madeleine that he ate. Marcel Proust was a preservationist who argued if you take the people outside of the spaces, if you take the priests outside of the cathedrals, you're killing the buildings. Because he said buildings and people are one thing. That interaction is what makes an interior. And he was writing at a time when the French government was passing a law to forbid priests from preaching in churches. There was an anti-clerical movement in France. Now, of course, here we have this new sheet of latex, of dust that is now interacting between the people in the building. So part of my work is also to introduce a new element, which is both an old and a new element, between people and the building. And in a way, it covers up the building and it reveals the building at the same time, and allows for a way to see the thing anew. And when people came in here, and as part of this moment in Brexit, they saw the building in a new way as a kind of telescoping of history, telescoping of the history of democracy. And they became very attached to it. There was a lot of reviews in the newspapers and a lot of interest from different national collections to save this work. And so the decision was made to actually cut it up into pieces and to send a piece of this installation to each of the national museums of the United Kingdom, the nations of the United Kingdom. So Northern Ireland has a piece, and Wales has a piece, and Scotland has a piece, and England has 2 pieces actually, because London got a piece. And so we cut it. We cut the thing. Now, if you think, okay, here, we give you a Picasso, now cut it into 5 pieces and distribute it. Well, you'd say, well, you just ruined the work, right? But for me, it was a way to actually give new meaning to the work, to distribute it, is to enhance and extend and expand the meaning of the work itself. And so here you have one of those, pieces of that building. That is one of the, if you notice, for example, this little piece over here, that's that piece over there. So this is a picture of the building, of the piece, sorry, that was sent to the Whitworth Museum in Manchester. So you see how this artwork now has become these smaller pieces and been distributed around. So London is not the only one that has all this environment with all this particulate matter that's floating in the air, that is adhering to buildings. Look at Chicago in 1907. It was even more polluted than London. And when you look very closely at where the pollution is coming from, it is actually not coming from industry. It's coming from each of the chimneys inside of these buildings. It's coming from the boilers. The interior architecture is the one that is making all of this pollution, because you cannot have interior architecture without actually heating up those spaces. And so if you cannot have interior architecture without burning fuel and making this environmental pollution, can we really say that environmental pollution, that material, that dust is not architecture? If we took it out, it would be the same as taking out the columns of the building. The whole architecture would collapse, meaning you wouldn't be able to use it for its purpose. So that's where I began to really think about pollution as an architectural material. How do we start to think about architecture as an interior architecture in relationship to energy? And that was another text. This is the founder of the Columbia program, James Marston Fitch, who was thinking about that very question all the way in the 1940s when he was writing for House Beautiful, but into the 1970s, where he just kept saying, and he felt like he was a bit like, Cassandra, because he kept saying, stop building buildings, preserve what we have. We are wasting energy and we're polluting the world. And of course, that's why he started the preservation program. But look at, the thing is, it's hard to imagine the fact that people were saying, not paying attention to him, because they had come from a world, the people that had lived in the 1940s, that was so much more polluted than the 1970s. And so they said, well, what are you talking about? Everything's so much better. We're doing great. Because look at the 1940s, look at the 1913 photo on the left. These are pictures taken in the middle of the day in Pittsburgh. And it looks like it's nighttime, but it's not nighttime, it's daytime. The reason why the sun's not shining is because there is a huge black cloud of pollution hovering over Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is the place where most of the steel for architecture was created. It has the big industry. It's the heart of the Rust Belt. And of course, it has a tremendous history of environmental health impacts. And of course, the minute that all of that industry started to falter in the post-war period, when the war economy started to die down, what did people do? They said, oh, well, now that we don't have industry and we don't have smoke anymore, let's clean it up again and let's remove all of the dust. Now, it's hard not to read the kind of racial connotations of the caption at the bottom of this, and the attempt to make Pittsburgh white again, because in fact, of course, it was never white. It was never white in terms of the population, but it was also never white in terms of its buildings. The buildings were not white. And the reason why they were terracotta was because terracotta was a material that was resistant to acid rain and resistant to smoke, pollution. And so it was meant to have this dust on it. they knew that it was going to be polluted. So to remove the dust was actually to negate a history of the environment and to lose a big part of the history. So here you have this whole effort in the post-war to clean up the facades of buildings, to clean up to remove the dust and to make it disappear. In a way, for me, this is not unlike the idea of removing the fence from the US Embassy and making it disappear. It's another way of removing history and making a decision about what belongs to the building and what doesn't belong to the building. And so here you have the scaffolding, of course, and they're the workers cleaning up the building. But this is the origin of preservation as a big industry. It's facade cleanup, is facade stabilization. Then with local law 11, now we have facade inspections every 5 years with every building in New York City. That's the bread and butter of preservation firms. And so it's very important for me to remind us that with every act of removing a piece of architecture, we're also silencing the past. And one of the great writers that brought up this question was Michel Rolph-Trouillot, who is a Haitian sociologist, who talked about the way in which the Haitian Revolution was actually silenced from history because it was a Black revolution. And in the Western canon, even though Black contributions to the Western canon have been there since the beginning of the Western canon, somehow there has been this continuous silencing of those contributions, and to the detriment of Western culture, not to acknowledge a big part of itself. And so he talks about this in terms of monuments in Haiti, and how Haitian monuments have been not acknowledged in preservation and not kept up. So very important for us to take those lessons and to think about interiors in those ways. And that was something that I was thinking about when I was invited to do this work at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I was asked to do an artwork that would be a response to the museum's collection. And I think I'll stop after this work, so we can leave time for Q&A. I could go on forever, but I think it'll be a good moment for me to stop with this last project. And what happened here was, okay, so I was invited to do this work. I said, okay, what do we do? I started looking around, and I was attracted to this room, which is a room of plaster casts. It's called the cast room. And it has in it this gigantic column, which is a copy of Trajan's column in Rome. And the copy was made in 1861 by Napoleon III, his administration, because they realized that Trajan's column in Rome was already, it has a very famous bas-relief of Trajan conquering the Dacians across the Danube. And that bas-relief was melting because of environmental pollution. So already in the 1860s, they knew about acid rain. They called it sulfuric rain. And so they said, well, there's nothing we can do about the rain, so let's just make a copy of this thing so we can at least preserve what it looked like now. Of course, what did they do? They brought it to London in like a ribbon of plaster casts, and then they had to put it up somehow. They were missing the interior of the column, so they built a chimney. They called the same people that were building chimneys for the Industrial Revolution, and they built a humongous, actually two humongous chimneys. They didn't have smoke coming out of them, but it's the same structure and built exactly the same. And then they put the copy of Trajan's column, they glued it around this chimney. And for me, it was amazing because this is the largest object in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And the chimney itself, which for me is the most important object, didn't have a catalog number. The only catalog number is for the plaster casts. I said, we really need to acknowledge the chimneys in here as because it's all, Victoria and Albert Museum is all about labor and craft and workers and so on. I'm like, well, this is a great work of craft. But what was happening in the 1970s? I'm sorry, 1870s. Look at this painting. This is a phenomenal painting by James Webb. And when you first look at it, the title is St. Paul's from the River Thames. And you think it's a picture of St. Paul's, but when you actually look very carefully at it, and I show you a blow up on the bottom right-hand side, the painter has taken such pains to actually paint the smoke and the various kinds of smoke and their effects on visual perception. And so if you look at this smoke over here, this white smoke versus the reddish tint that the smoke creates, the particulate matter as you get further and further away from it, he's doing a tremendous job at actually painting that and showing you what we today would call haze or environmental pollution, airborne pollution. And John Ruskin, who was one of the fathers of historic preservation and modern art, because he was one of the big defenders of Turner, wrote that he was a very interesting man because he would wake up every morning and the first thing he would do was to paint the clouds outside his window. And he did beautiful watercolors every day. And so he was paying attention to the sky. And he said, in 1876, it's the last time I saw pure weather above London smoke. In other words, he's not looking at this. He's not looking at this stuff. That's polluted. He's looking at above. He's saying that's pure weather. The smoke doesn't reach that high. He said, that's the end. 1876 is when I last saw pure weather above London. So, I went inside this building, this chimney, and so here, what I'm doing over here is I'm actually taking the latex. So I use this latex poultice, and I apply the latex to the surface of the walls. Here we are in the interior we're inside Trajan's column, and I apply this in liquid or pasty form. And then it sits there and it dries. And eventually, once it dries, I'm able to then remove it. And as it dries, it starts to absorb all of the dust into it because of the way that the water evaporates from inside the dust, inside the latex. It pools on the surface of the wall. So here you have, we're pulling the latex from the interior, in a sense, transferring the dust onto the latex. And here you have on the left, this is the cast of the interior, and this is the exterior of Trajan's column. So these are the two pieces of Trajan's column. They didn't have enough room to put it all together. Now, what was really important for me here was to exhibit pollution inside of this room, because this room is the poor man's grand tour of European culture. And to me, it was very important to acknowledge that we wouldn't have all of that culture without making a gigantic amount of pollution, without polluting the atmosphere, in fact. And so I wanted the contrast between pollution and culture to be a new dialogue, a very literal dialogue. Here, can we consider pollution as part of this museum's collection, the dust of the museum as part of its collection? And can we then make it as an opportunity to have a new dialogue about what culture means and how we think of monuments and how we think of heritage and how we think of our interiors as registers of our environment and registers of our human behavior, not just in place, but more broadly in our planet. So I'll stop there. I could show you more works, but I think it's important for us to make a little bit of time to talk.
All right. I just want to give you applause.
Well, thank you.
Jorge, you said at one point, give new meaning, but I think you just gave us new meaning in areas that we might have thought we understood, like interior design. But in preservation, that has a new meaning, I think, for all of us after hearing you speak, and even the idea of pollution. and tying these all together for us was beautifully done. And
Thank you so much for the invitation. Such a pleasure. Great conversation too.
thank you.
Okay.
Okay, everyone have a good night.